the economic history of women. Now, as it says here, this is a often forgotten and even more misunderstood subject. Women generally do not, until recently, figure very prominently in economic history. They're overlooked. There's lots of stuff about famous men. There's lots of stuff about machinery. But the work that women do is typically overlooked or only studied when it impacts on the work that men do. And to the extent that there has been an increase in the attention paid to the economic role of women in the past, until recently, it's been very significantly misunderstood. A lot of what is going on is not seen in the correct way. So, as it says here, it's been neglected. That's the first point to realize. Now, one of the reasons why it's been neglected is a persistent assumption on the part of economists, which is that paid work is the only kind of work that really exists, and certainly the only kind of work that matters. Now, as we'll see, for a lot of human history, and indeed right now as well, a great deal of the work that women do is unpaid. It's domestic, it's part of the family sphere. And this means that therefore, given this assumption, it's invisible to a lot of economists, I'm afraid. But that does not mean that it's not significant or important. Quite the opposite, it's actually foundational and vital. But what this means, this blind spot, is that, as I've said, the economic role of women is historically neglected. Now, the point also to grasp is that over time, there have been significant changes in the economic role and position of women. And in particular, the economic role and position of women in the modern era, the capitalist era, if you will, is significantly different to what it was in really pretty much all of human history before the modern age. And so the economic position of women has been transformed during capitalist modernity. And this transformation, which has been enormously beneficial for women, is still continuing. Now, here are the structural realities that women face for most of history, which determine really the whole of their life, but which in particular have an enormous impact upon their economic position. The first is that women are, on the average, on the whole, but very clearly, smaller and less physically strong than men. They are, as it says here, more robust and resilient than men. That is why one of the structural facts of demography, now and in the past, is that at every single age group, women die less frequently than men. And that's also why the percentage of the elderly that is female has always been larger than the percentage that is male. But generally speaking, women are less physically strong than men and smaller. Now, what this means is that in a world where physical strength and often physical violence or the threat of violence is central and very important, women are at a structural disadvantage compared to men. When physical strength brings not only greater output, but also power and physical control, women are systematically and structurally in a weaker position, literally a weaker position. This was the point, for example, that Ludwig von Mises made very forcefully in his Socialism, which he published back in the 1920s. But he's only one of a number of famous economists who've made this point. The other big structural reality is this one: women get pregnant and have children. And until very, very recently in history, until really the very end of the 19th century, there was no reliable means of contraception. And what this means, as it says at the bottom, is that for most women in most places, regular sex meant children. And this obviously enormously constrained the range of options open to them. And it also tended to structure their economic position in society as well as their broader social position. They were intimately associated with the care of children, the birth of children, the rearing of children. So not only were their options restricted, but also there was a whole structural effect upon the position that they had in society, arising out of the fact, not only the obvious biological fact that women can have children and men cannot, but also the fact that women had no control over this. Now, the condom, the first effective prophylactic, really becomes available as a mass consumer product as opposed to a rare luxury in the 1880s onwards. But that's still a form of contraception which is controlled by men. So the really big breakthrough takes place much, much later with the advent of the oral contraceptive, where it is women who finally are in control of their own fertility. So those are the two big structural realities which in all human societies through all of history affect the economic role of women. So what are those results? They're at an economic disadvantage relative to men. What that means is that they typically do work that has lower social status and brings in lower income than equivalent work done by men. Now, this does not mean that the work they do is not important. It's usually vitally important, but typically it's work where the person doing the work, the woman in this case, has less power, less self-determination, less ability to control what it is that they do than their male counterpart does. Now, it's worth saying that because of things like class structures, imbalances of wealth and the like, most men do not have much self-determination in their work either. But even so, a poor man will still have slightly more self-determination in terms of the work and what they do and the kind of work they do than a woman who is poor will do. So at every rank of the social hierarchy, generally speaking, the work that women do is less self-directed, as well as being, in most cases, there are obviously exceptions to this, less well remunerated, less well paid in one way or another. There's always a sexual division of labour. What this means is that in every society, certain kinds of work, certain kinds of productive activity are seen as male, pertaining to men, and other kinds of activity are seen as pertaining to women. Now, the way this sexual division of labour works varies enormously. So in West Africa, for example, things like being involved in trade, market activities, mercantile exchange, a lot of physical labour in the field is typically seen as female. So if you go to, even today, to markets in places like Ghana, you'll see that most of the traders are women, not men. Conversely, in many other societies, it's the case that that kind of work is very much seen as male. So the fact of a sexual division of labour, that some jobs are women's jobs, some jobs are men's jobs, doesn't say anything about exactly which jobs are allocated into which sphere. Generally speaking, though, with some notable exceptions, but marginal exceptions, the jobs that are allocated into the women's sphere are the lower status ones historically. The one thing, however, that is universal for obvious reasons, bearing in mind what I just said, is that women do most childcare. This is still true today, and it was even more so in many ways in the past. Typically, caring of children, bringing up of young children in particular, is very much a female role. And this typically takes up a very large part of the life of the average woman for most of human history. Worth saying also that most women in human history are pregnant a lot of the time. The percentage, the number of children born by women is much higher than anything we would imagine today. And many women from both the elite, royalty right down to the bottom, spend a significant part of their life pregnant. This is all obviously extremely dangerous, and in fact the chances of dying either in childbirth or within a couple of weeks after childbirth from peripuerial fever are as high as 25% on each instance for most women historically, which is one of the reasons why I have all the stepmothers. Now, most women's work historically, finally, is not paid. Historically, this was the same as men. Most men's work was also not paid historically. But gradually over time, you start to get a period, as we'll see, when there's a big distinction, when men's work comes to be paid, but most women's work continues to be unpaid. It takes place within the home. It's not part of the paid labour market. Now, what is the situation in pre-modern Europe, for example? I'm talking about Europe here, but by extension, you can talk actually about pretty much any pre-modern civilization. Most people are farmers, or they work in farming-related trades, things like making and repairing agricultural machinery. The division of labour is that women do work which is associated with the household. they tend to do work which brings them either into the home or keeps them very close to the home. So on many farms, for example, they will tend to do the dairy work, which the milking of cows, making milk, making butter, making all the other dairy products, because this is done typically in or close to the home. Outside the home, the men do most of the work in the fields and the actual ploughing and harvesting of the food. The women do work there, but the work tends to be supplementary to the work of men in those areas. They also do non-domestic work and trading. Money lending is a major female occupation, for example, in Renaissance Europe. And also in Europe and Asia, although they do this kind of thing, it's often done in the husband's name. As I've already said, West Africa is different in this respect. Now, the elite is slightly different from this. Elite women often have a much more active kind of role, and one that isn't straightforwardly of the same sort as that done by lower class women. So it may appear that this is an area where women have much more independence and economic freestanding, if you will. But you've got to be very careful not to fall into the trap of what's called the queen bee syndrome. Queens and female aristocrats are a very small proportion of the total number of women in society at this time. So the kind of economic independence and status and freedom of maneuver and action that they had, like the top 1% or half of 1% of society, is not typical. So you must be very careful not to draw wider or general conclusions from the peculiar and particular experience, economic and otherwise, of elite women. Now here we've got a painting by the Dutch painter Pierre Bruegel of a harvest, and you'll see here that there is a sexual division of labour. The men here, see the chap here with the scythe, are doing the actual harvesting. The women are doing the supplementary work, the picking up of the gleaning, as it was called, of the remnants or parts of the stuff that has been harvested, and the stacking of the straw into hay. They're also providing down here at the bottom, as you'll see, the food, drink and refreshments for the men who are taking a break from the harvesting work. And so this is typical of the kind of division of labour that you would see in the pre-modern agricultural economy. The heavy manual work is done by men, the women do the supportive work, if you will, and they also do work which is not visible in this picture, obviously, of things like, as I said, dairy work, but also a whole range of other tasks and roles which take place mainly within the actual home. Now, there's then, however, a big change. In the 18th century, what you get is the advent of modern commercial capitalism. And what you see along with this is a marked acceleration and growth of women's involvement in the paid labour force. Throughout the last 2/3 of the 18th century, well into the first half of the 19th century, women come to get involved more and more in various kinds of work outside the home. You see, for example, the advent of mill girls, of women working, young single women initially, particularly, working in the new factories of industrialized textile production. So between 1820 and going on right through to the end of the 19th century, more and more women come to work in certain sectors of the economy. Textiles is a big one. Women tend to work in that sector rather than, say, iron manufacturing and iron founding. The reason being that iron founding still requires physical strength, and when men have an advantage there. But on the other hand, in textiles, much less physical strength required, manual dexterity is perhaps what you need more, where women actually tend to excel over men. You also tend to get a large growth in female employment in offices. Towards the end of the 19th century, a big growth in female employment in a whole range of other factory trades, or trades that move into the factory. Things like matchmaking, for example, very famously in the case of companies like Bryant and May. Now, there is a reaction against this, and the reaction takes the form of, from about the 1850s onwards, a series of legislative limitations on female labour. So women are banned, for example, first of all from working underground in the mining industry, and then later on they're banned even from working above ground in the mining industry, doing things like sorting and cleaning and collecting coal. You also get the growth of the idea of the family wage, as it's called, which is the idea that a man should earn enough money to support a household on his own so that his wife did not have to work. This was known officially as the family wage. It becomes one of the major demands of organised labour and trades unions. And the idea is that women should not be continuing to expand their role in the paid labour market. They should rather become, once again, home workers, but this time be doing work which is unpaid and which is no longer part of an integrated productive process as it had been before. Now here you have a picture of one of those factory workers from this is from the 1880s. This is a woman tending to a large spinning mule. She's basically cleaning the bobbins there. What you also get at this time is what's known as the woman question. The growth of the economic independence and economic self-determination of women that was brought about by industrial capitalism and the family system found expression in a big set of debates. So all across 19th century Europe and America, you have an enormous argument about the role, the social status, and the economic position and role of women. It's important to realize, as it says here, this is not just about the vote. Whether or not women should have the vote and be involved in politics was indeed a central part of the woman question. But this was also important. Female employment and the economic position of women. Should women work in paid occupations outside the home? That became one of the very hot button political issues. The pressure and the logic of the capitalist market economy was that women should be doing this. And it also benefited women, and lots of women wanted to do it because of the greater freedom and greater personal independence that it brought. But a lot of people, of course a lot of men, but also some women, didn't like it. Now there was an active feminist movement which appears as an active and organised movement in the early 19th century. There are what you might call proto-feminists before this, but they typically are isolated individuals. So what you actually get for the first time with modern capitalism is an active feminist movement. Now, most of these so-called first-wave feminists are hardline laissez-faire individualists. There are socialist feminists, but they're very much in the minority. The great majority are extreme hardline advocates of laissez-faire. Here are some examples. Here is a lady called Jessie Boucheray. She is one of the leading feminists in 19th century England. Amongst other things, she founds and sets up a society, an organisation rather, called the Society for Promoting the Employment of Women, which is an organisation that campaigns against legislative restrictions on women's right to work, but also encourages training and other opportunities for women who want to enter the world of paid work. Here's her collaborator in that endeavour, a lady called Helen Blackburn, also a leading advocate of votes for women and the author of a big history of that campaign. But in fact, she herself thought that her campaigns in favour of women's economic independence were much more important. One of the things that both Boucheray and Blackburn emphasised, as most of these feminists did, was that having women being able to work in a market economy meant that they were no longer economically dependent on men and therefore no longer forced into marriage because of the need to be supported by a man later on in life. And so they thought that this would transform female employment, that is, not just the economic status of women, but the relationship they had with men and their social position. And this argument was made by people like Helen Blackburn, Jessie Boucheray, Barbara Bodichon, very much on classical, liberal, laissez-faire grounds. Domestic life is transformed as well. From about the 1890s through to the 1950s, the life of the home was completely transformed by innovations that took place in the capitalist economy. The heterodox economist Ha-Joon Chang has an essay in which he argues that the washing machine was more important than the internet. Now, I don't often agree with him, but in this, he's absolutely correct. Spot on, in fact. The washing machine and other domestic appliances had an enormously transformative effect upon the way home life was organised. And this was particularly transformative for women because of women's continuing domestic and childcare roles. So family and domestic relations were totally transformed by this. But there was also a shift in public policy against female participation in paid work, as I said. The kind of movement that we saw in the second half of the 19th century accelerates in the first part of the 20th century. So here is the transformed home. This is a typical modern home, and what you'll notice is the number of devices here: the fridge, the washing machine, the dishwasher, the microwave oven, all of which have completely transformed domestic life. And in particular, what they've done is to reduce the amount of work that women have to do in the home, or for that matter, if they can be bothered, men. Here is a very interesting woman. This is Frances Perkins, who was Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor. She was one of only two people who served right throughout his time as president, from 1932 to 1945. Now, Frances Perkins was a feminist, but she also strongly supported the idea that women should not be engaged in the world of paid work, and that you should have instead a family wage system. She thought that really women should only work outside the home when they were single. If they were not single, then normally they should be at home looking after the family, and that this should be made possible by a family wage system. So she represented a shift in social democracy and also feminism of a kind in the middle decades of the 20th century towards the family wage system, and it becomes strongly associated with social democratic politics, both in Europe, e.g. in Sweden, and in the United States. However, there's then another transformation. Contraception and birth control was a major feature of feminist and liberal campaigns because it was seen as bringing greater female independence. There were other reasons as well, it's worth saying, to do with Malthusianism, but that's not what concerns us here. The critical breakthrough came in 1960, when the pill, the oral contraceptive, was made available for women by the Food and Drugs Administration. It was not funded by public money. There was not 1 cent of public money given to fund the research by a man called Gregory Pincus, which led to the creation of the contraceptive pill. It was entirely private. Some of it came from Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood, a charity, but the great bulk of it, the overwhelming amount of it, came from a private source, a woman called Catherine McCormick. And it was only possible in an industrial capitalist society. Why? Because only an industrial capitalist society would have, first of all, the very large concentrations of private wealth required, and secondly, have part of that private wealth controlled by women. Because Catherine McCormick was a multimillionairess because she was the heiress to the international harvester fortune, the McCormick family's fortune. And here she is. Shown as a young woman, and as you'll see, she's engaged at this point, this is in the early 1920s, in a campaign for the constitutional amendment that gave votes to women. She was an ardent feminist throughout her life, and another example of a woman who combined strong feminism with classical liberal principles. And so here, what can we say about capitalism and the economic social position of women? It's been transformative and liberatory. Since the late 18th century, capitalism and market economies have transformed the economic position of women in the direction of much, much greater independence. This is partly simply due to the greater wealth and innovation. What this means, as Mises pointed out, is that physical strength and power have become less important, and therefore that advantage that men historically had over women has become less and less significant. The innovation of the contraceptive pill, in particular, has also removed the other structural disadvantage. There's also, though, the logic of the capitalist market economy. It is incredibly economically inefficient to have 50% of your population not engaged in using their talents in productive activity, or having them only using their talents in a certain kind of productive activity. This is simply incredibly wasteful. The whole economic logic of a capitalist economy is to economically emancipate women. And therefore, the structural features I've described earlier are slowly removed by the evolution of the market economy. Not quickly, though. It does take quite a long time, but the direction of the change is quite clear. What is the situation today, finally? Is there a gender pay gap? Yes, there is. Women generally are paid less than men. However, it's more sense to call it a motherhood pay gap. Once you take out the fact that women generally do all the childcare, the reason for the pay gap pretty much disappears. Single women who do not, or women, married women who do not have children, are actually paid the same or slightly more than men doing comparable work. The gender pay gap is steadily shrinking and going away. It will probably be gone within 10 years on current trends in the UK. And the main reason why we still have one is because of the fact that mothers do most childcare. This actually leads to a very radical feminist conclusion, which is that the way to get rid of the gender pay gap and to have complete economic equality between men and women in that regard is for men to do more childcare and women to hand over some of the childcaring responsibilities to them. And so market logic is making it disappear. And so this is an example of how the process of female economic emancipation is actually continuing, and it is historically social democracy and interference in the capitalist economy that has hindered this or worked in the opposite direction. Allowing the logic of the capitalist economy full expression is actually the most effective way of reducing things like the gender pay gap and increasing the economic independence of women.